Welcome back to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you from the Rocky Mountain town of Crested Butte, Colorado. I am your host, Mark Trautman, CFP. This educational personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. On this third episode of Mark's Money Mind, we are going to break this up into 3 parts. But before we get to that, I would like to say this weekend is going to be pretty cool. I am going to the EconoMe Conference in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am actually participating in a case study that will be presented on the main stage. It will be on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. And I don't know if those who are watching on YouTube can see my EconoMe t-shirt here. I'm all ready to go. The case study is basically something new. It's something that is frequently done at Camp FIs and at local Choose FI meetup groups, where someone opens the door to their finances, their financial situation, and looks for some guidance on how they might proceed and potentially some blind spots that they may not be recognizing. It is certainly in a non-judgmental space. We're just there to help and look at different situations. If we were in that situation, what we might do or some suggestions. We have a panel of 5 individuals who will be reviewing the case study. A person was selected from applicants, and there were a number of applicants, and we selected one participant. We have about 25 to 30 minutes to go over the case study. We are going to do our best to give some ideas to this individual or individuals, as the case may be, to help them on their journey to reaching their financial goals and potentially financial independence if that's what they're seeking. So, who are the panelists? I'm not going to tell you who the case study participant is. That's a surprise. You'll have to come to EconoMe to see who that is. But the panelists are Sarah Catherine Gutierrez, who is a CFP and author of the book First Save 10. We also have Natalie Collodi, who is an enrolled agent, which is an IRS designation for tax preparers, and she is also a national tax educator. We have Jackie Cummings-Koski, also a CFP, and who is also the new co-host of the Catching Up to 5 podcast, where you may have heard me previously as a co-host. She is stepping in the shoes of Becky Heptig and will be the new co-host going forward. I don't think any of her shows have come out yet, but they will be coming out soon with Bill Yount as the other co-host, so look for those. Jackie is also the author of Money Letters to My Daughter. She is coming out with a new book, Fire for Dummies, F-I-R-E, which is Financial Independence, Retire Early. And then lastly, we have, not lastly, but he's an awesome dude, Frank Vasquez. He's a retired lawyer and the host of Risk Parity Radio podcast, an all-around jokester, so he will certainly keep us entertained. And yours truly. So I'm the 5th member. It should be a fun time. Look for us. Join us. Hopefully we're going to have a great time there all weekend. It is a super fun time. If you are planning to attend or in the area or choose to come, please do. It's a great time. And if you can't come this year, certainly put it on your calendar for next year. It's always around this time of the year. And I'm not getting paid to do this by any means. I just really support what Diana is doing, and she puts on a great event, and you will not be disappointed. Also, look for me if you're there. Let me know that you're a listener of the show, and I will have some swag for you. We have some fun things that I'll be handing out for anyone who listens to the show, or anyone else who asks for that matter. And so this show, we're going to break this into 3 parts. The first part will be a money lesson. We're going to talk about the net worth statement. And one of the things that we do in a case study is we always create a net worth statement for the case study participant. And we also create an income statement. So this week, we'll talk about the net worth statement. And next week, we will talk about the income statement. In the second part of the show, I will be going over what I'll call money experiences. I recently was able to convert part of my daughter's leftover 529 assets into a Roth IRA using the new allowed rule that Secure 2 put into play, where you can convert leftover assets of a 529 plan into a Roth IRA. And we'll talk about who can do that, what are the requirements, and what my experience was doing that for the first time. In our third part, we have a listener question. One of the listeners wrote in, and anyone can do that. Just send your question to mark@marksmoneymind.com. Put podcast question in the subject line so I know that it's a question for the podcast. And I will try to answer as many of those as possible. It's not advice in any way. It's just how I might think about that situation if I were in that situation. So yes, listener question at the end of the show. So let's get started with this week's show. Welcome to the money lessons part of this show. We are going to discuss the net worth statement. And to give you a little background, when I teach the students in the class, as you may recall from earlier episodes, I teach a financial literacy / personal finance class to the seniors at our local high school here in Crested Butte. One of the questions I first ask them is how many people think they may own their own business one day? And interestingly, a lot of hands go up. And I think that's very interesting because most people I would have figured would think I'm just going to get a job, get a paycheck and so forth. But many people in the room do put their hand up. And one of the things I say is that if you're going to run your own business, you need some tools to manage that business. And I also suggest you might want to take a business class while you're in college, if that's what you choose to do, is to go to college. And you can learn some basics about how to manage a business. I talk about how you manage it from a financial perspective. And the thing that I discuss is that you need a few tools, but two primary tools for running your own business are the balance sheet and the income statement. And I say, now, if you think about personal finance, it's very much the same. You are running your own personal business. I like to think of it as there is a CEO and a CFO of the household. CEO stands for Chief Executive Officer, and that's usually the person at the top of the business stack who looks at all of the aspects of a business and thinks about things from a financial but also non-financial standpoint, the vision for the business, how it's running, and so forth. And the Chief Financial Officer, or CFO, is the one who's primarily responsible for managing the finances of the business. And I like to joke that my wife was the CEO and I was the CFO. And now that she's passed away, I'm both the CEO and the CFO. But there are two tools, like I said, that are important for the CFO, and that's the balance sheet and the income statement. In business, the balance sheet is basically a report that has two halves to it. On one half, the left-hand side, is assets. And on the other half, the right-hand side, is liabilities. All of the assets are added up on the left-hand side. You subtract from those all the liabilities on the right-hand side. And what you're left over with is owner's equity if it's a private company, or shareholders' equity if it's a public company. In personal finance, you basically have the same thing. We don't call it a balance sheet. We call it a net worth statement, but it's the same thing. Assets on the left, liabilities on the right, assets minus liabilities instead of owner's equity or shareholders' equity. The product of the equation is net worth. So we're going to talk about that today. And the income statement, we're going to save that for next week, because this would become a very long episode if we tried to cover both. So today we're just going to talk about the net worth statement. And here's why I think it's important. As I mentioned in the intro, we use these in case studies to determine where you're at right now. And the difference between a balance sheet, and let's just use the term net worth statement because we're talking about personal finances here going forward, and your income statement, which is basically all of your income and all of your expenses, is that a balance sheet is a point in time And an income statement is over the course of a specified period of time. So there are two distinct differences between those two reports. The net worth statement is a snapshot in time. The income statement is the product of a period of time. So let's save the income statement for next week and just talk about the net worth statement. So the simplest way to do this is to get a blank sheet of paper, draw a line vertically down the middle, and on the top of the left-hand side, write assets, and on top of the right-hand side, write liabilities. There are many worksheets out there. If you just Google net worth worksheet, you will come up with many different options. Some might be spreadsheets, some might be pieces of paper. One that I think is very useful is one that's produced by Charles Schwab, and I will link to that in the show notes. I will go through that one because I think it's very good. It is a PDF, so you can print it and write in the numbers by hand. It is not one that you can actively fill in, but you could use it as a template to create your own spreadsheet. It would be very easy to do this. So, left-hand side, assets. Let's go through those. I like to think of assets as three different primary categories. The first is cash and cash equivalents, and we'll discuss what is involved in each of these sections in a moment. Let's just start off with what the three sections are: cash and cash equivalents, invested assets or investment assets, and then the last is use assets. And we'll talk about what these are and how they work. So let's start off with cash and cash equivalents. As you might imagine, it is pure cash. If you have a whole bunch of cash in your house, that would be a line item. Typically, it's going to be money that is in checking accounts, savings accounts, money market accounts. If you have savings bonds, if you have certificates of deposits, you could even include the cash value of life insurance if you have it. Typically, we talk about term life insurance, which does not have a cash value, but whole life insurance, if you do have one of those policies, there may be a cash value. That is probably less likely. The key ones are your checking account, your savings account. We talked about high yield savings accounts in the last episode as a place to keep your emergency fund. So that would be included in this category. Money market accounts might be, I would consider them to be standalone money market accounts as opposed to the money market investments within an investment account. So just pure standalone money market accounts, which are somewhat common, but less common these days. Most people are just going to have their checking account and savings account and maybe CDs or something like that. So that's cash and cash equivalents. And then what I would do is I would total up those items. So then you have a total cash figure. So that's part one. That's the easiest part. Now we get to part two, which is investment assets. And I like to divide these up, and Charles Schwab does this on the template. If you're following along, you will see that they divide investment assets into taxable accounts, retirement accounts, and things like business ownership interests, for example. So let's talk about those three subcategories under investment assets. Taxable accounts would be things like your regular brokerage account, for example. That's usually what most people will have as their taxable investment account, which is basically an account that you can open at a brokerage firm. You can buy individual stocks, you can buy mutual funds, you can buy whatever, but basically the money that you deposited into that account, there was no tax advantage in any way. Any income from that account is taxed on your regular tax return and so forth. So taxable accounts generally consist of brokerage account assets. Then we get to retirement accounts, and this is where there's a number of different flavors. The main one that most people think of is their 401k plan or 403b plan through work. You may have a 401a plan. My wife had one of those working for a municipal government. So any of those accounts would be one item. You may have a individual retirement account, IRA. It could be a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. I would put them as two separate line items. If you have a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA, I would make them two separate line items. And on the Schwab form, it just says IRA and Roth IRA. What they mean by the regular IRA is the traditional IRA. There are other types of retirement accounts like SEP IRAs. They used to have Keogh accounts many years ago. You might have a pension that has a vested benefit on the statement. You could include that. You may have an annuity with an accumulated value. So those would all be retirement type assets. And again, you would just put lines for ones that you have or fill in the blanks on the form here for the accounts that you have. You can aggregate all of the Roth IRA accounts. For example, if you're a couple and you each have one, you could just aggregate those in the Roth IRA line, for example. And then the third section is business ownership interests. This could be things like, let's say you have a rental property that you rent out for income purposes. I would include that in the business interest area. If you own your own company and there's a net worth to it, whether it's an S corporation or a C corporation or a partnership, this is where the net worth of those would go, not the income. The net worth of those businesses would go here. And for the rental real estate, I would be putting the actual market value of that real estate in this section. And you may have an LLC, for example. So just business ownership values go here. So what is the value you should use for all these items? You are doing a net worth statement as of a specific date. Most people will do one as of December 31st. Right now would be December 31st of 2023. You can gather all of your year-end statements and use those numbers from those statements to fill in the form. Again, this is at a stated point in time, and I would be doing a net worth statement at least once a year, and December 31st is a great date to choose because you're going to get all of these year-end statements. And even for business ownership interest, you probably can get values as of the end of the year if financials are issued for those. But this is an easy point in time to create your net worth statement. Then I would total up all of your invested assets. Then we get to the last category, which is use assets. A use asset has value, but it's not necessarily an investment asset and it's not a cash asset. Its primary purpose is for your use of that asset. And things in this category include your primary residence. If you own a non-rental vacation home, for example, that would go there. You would also potentially put in the liquidation value of any vehicles, for example. You could include things like home furnishings. I tend to not do that because there's not a lot of value to them. However, if you have a valuable collection of something, whether it's art, collectibles of some nature, you could include that. But I would only do it if it's a significant figure. And again, I would do it at a very conservative liquidation value, not a hope for value, but if it literally had to be sold tomorrow to a non-interested party, what could you truly get for it? And so all of the use assets go here, and then you total those up, and then you go back and you total up your total cash value, your total invested asset value, and your total use value, and you get to total assets. And that's it. So we've completed the left-hand side of the net worth statement. Now it's time to move to the right-hand side. And the right-hand side, and on this Charles Schwab sheet, it's just listed lower, which is fine. You can do it that way. It doesn't have to be on one side or the other. But the reason that typically it's divided into halves, if you think about the business balance sheet, What does that mean? The two sides need to balance, hence the term balance sheet. So the left-hand side has to equal the right-hand side. And the way you do that is your total assets need to equal the amount on the right-hand side, which would be the liabilities plus whatever value is required to make the two sides balance. And in business, it's owner's equity and shareholder equity. And in personal finance, it's net worth. And that's the balancing mechanism in essence. All right, so let's move to the right-hand side. We're talking about liabilities. This is fairly simple. You can either group them all together, or in many cases, we divide them into current liabilities and long-term liabilities. And current liabilities are typically those debts that are due within 1 year, and long-term liabilities would be liabilities that have a life of a year or more. So let's think about current liabilities. These would be credit card balances. These might be if you owed someone money in a short period of time. It might be, for instance, a tax liability or any other outstanding bill that has yet to be paid but is due within the next year. So that would be your current liabilities. And you can subtotal all of those. And then we get to long-term liabilities. And long-term liabilities include the key one that most people think of is a home mortgage if you own your own home, a home equity line of credit if you have one of those as well. This would also include the mortgages on the rental properties that you listed in the asset side of your investment category. They would include any car loans. You've listed the value of the car as an asset, but you also need to list the value of the loan as a liability. These would include student loans. They might include if you borrowed against a life insurance policy, for example, or any other long-term debt would go here. And then you can subtotal your long-term debts. And then to get total liabilities, simply total the subtotal of your current liabilities and the subtotal of your long-term liabilities, and then you get your total liabilities. And once we have that, we can calculate our net worth. And that is simply taking total assets minus total liabilities equals net worth. Now, you may be asking, what if my number is a negative number? That is a very real possibility, especially for, let's say you just graduated from college, you don't have very many assets, and you have some student loans. It's very possible, in fact, it's likely that your net worth will be negative, and that's to be expected. But what is missing on the net worth statement that we didn't include here? And shouldn't be included in net worth statement, but it has real value, especially for somebody who's just starting out their working life. That is the ability to earn money over your lifetime. And if you had to calculate that, you could do a present value calculation of all future earnings and discount it back to the present using an appropriate rate of interest, which is how you do discounted cash flow. And you could theoretically come up with a value of your earnings potential. I don't recommend you do that, but just be aware that there are assets to be generated over time by working or owning your own business and having earnings from that business that are not included on net worth statements. So don't freak out if your net worth is negative. The goal here is to calculate this on a periodic basis. And again, I would consider doing this at least once a year. If you want to do it more often, maybe twice a year at December 31st and June 30th, so you have an even spacing between them. Many people will also consider doing it quarterly. You could create a spreadsheet, and each tab could be a year end, or it could be a quarter end if you choose to do that. And the goal here is to see your progression. So by doing this on a periodic basis, you can see maybe you started out with a negative net worth, and then a year later, you can see, oh, wow, this is really improved. I'm maybe at zero. That's great. You've made progress. And then in year 2, maybe you have now a positive net worth. And then the goal here is to not just calculate what is my net worth number, but then to look back across your assets and liabilities and look for ways that they could be improved. Maybe you have excess cash, but you have credit cards. Well, I would consider maybe paying off those credit cards. It's not going to change your net worth because you're just taking some assets and paying off a liability, but it could improve your situation because those credit cards likely have a very high interest rate. And then some people will ask me, what if I have credit card balances as of December 31st, but I pay them off every month? You still include it. And the reason is because it's a snapshot in time. That liability exists. And if you pay it off at the end of the month anyway, that cash is likely going to be in the value that you put in either your checking or savings figure on the asset side. So yes, do include the actual credit card balances, even if you do pay them off in full every month. And then the other thing I like to do is put little footnotes. So what I do is, especially on things like liabilities, is I will notate each liability. And at the bottom of my spreadsheet, because I do this with a spreadsheet, I will notate what is the interest rate of that liability, what are the terms of that debt, especially like a mortgage, like when was it originally taken out? What was the original amount? What is the interest rate? And what is the minimum payment? Because then I can look down to those notes and see, oh, wow, my credit card interest rate is very high if I had a credit card debt, which of course we don't want to have that. We want to be paying off our credit cards in full every month. But let's say you're new to this and you have credit card debt. At least you can see in your notes that, wow, that interest rate is very high. If I'm going to prioritize something, that would be something to prioritize. And in almost all cases, that's going to be the case, to prioritize paying off credit cards first, because they are going to have the highest interest rate. And then you may say, okay, I don't have any credit card balances, or I've eliminated all my credit card balances. What's the next one? Then I would look down in my notes and see that maybe my car loan has the next highest rate. And then that's what I would focus on, paying the minimum payments and everything else and paying off the next highest rate loan and so forth. So that's why the little notations are very helpful. This will wrap up the net worth section. I went on a little long there, but it does take quite a bit. I definitely suggest you consider downloading the net worth worksheet that Charles Schwab has provided, or do a Google search for any other net worth worksheet that will work for your purposes. Consider creating a easy, simple spreadsheet to track this and each tab for a year end. Or if you want to geek out more like I do and do it every quarter, that's great. And a lot of people will do this in January, but this is a good time of the year. You've probably collected all of your statements. You're getting ready to do your taxes, or you may have done them already. So this information should be readily available. Again, remember, it's a point in time, so you want to use all of the same period ending statements when you're completing your net worth statement. I hope you do this. I think it's a great starting point. This is definitely something that should be done every year if you want to be monitoring your finances. So that's our money lesson for today, the net worth statement. All right, moving on to part 2 of the podcast. I'm calling this Money Experiences. You may be aware that under the Secure 2.0 Act of 2022, and SECURE stands for Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement, there was a provision in it that would allow money left over in a 529 to be rolled over into a Roth IRA. It's considered what they call a special rollover. Now, typically, if you have money left in your 529 and you make a distribution, it would be subject to a 10% penalty and tax on the earnings portion of that distribution. So this was added as a special ability to allow owners of 529s to, in essence, convert leftover assets into a Roth IRA. Now, there are a number of stipulations to enable it to be a qualified conversion. Number 1, the 529 account must have existed for at least 15 years. Number 2, the 529 account assets that are getting transferred to the Roth IRA must have been in the account for at least 5 years. Number 3, 529 assets rolled over to a Roth IRA in the name of the 529 account beneficiary. So in other words, they can only go to the named beneficiary of that account, not to someone else. There is a limit as to how much you can roll over. It is a lifetime limit of $35,000 per beneficiary. And it also is capped by the annual Roth IRA limit. For example, in 2024, the limit for a Roth IRA contribution is $7,000. So it would take you 5 years to basically get the $35,000 into the Roth IRA, and that is not in addition to your normal contribution limit. As you may be aware, you can only contribute a certain amount to a combination of the Roth and traditional IRAs for 2024. That's $7,000. This would not be in addition to that amount. This would take place of that. So it's not a way to get additional money into your Roth IRA. It's just a way to use the current limits and get it from the 529 as opposed to making the contribution directly. The effective date was January 1st of 2024. This avoids the 10% withdrawal penalty and the federal tax on earnings for non-qualified distributions, which means non-educational expenses. Now, there is an area of this rule that has yet to be determined. Does the 15-year clock restart if the beneficiary is changed? You may be aware that you can change a beneficiary of a 529 plan. So, for instance, I am the custodian of my daughter's 529 plan. So I'm the custodian, she's the beneficiary. I can change that beneficiary. I could change it to myself. I could change it to a sibling if she had one. I could change it to a child of hers, for example. And there's a number of other allowable beneficiary changes you can make. And typically they're related party people. For instance, the question would be, if she satisfied all of the rules, but I changed the beneficiary to myself and I had earned income and was eligible to make a Roth IRA contribution, could I do it? That has not been clarified. So we're waiting for clarification on that. So that's to be determined. All right, getting back to my experience. Does the account qualify? In our case, it does. The account was opened in 2008. So it satisfies the account must have been open for at least 15 years requirement. There have been no contributions in the last 5 years, so it meets that. And my daughter has been a beneficiary of this account since it was opened. So that is not an issue. She does have earned income, so she meets the qualification of being able to contribute to a Roth IRA. So we saw this as a perfect opportunity to convert or roll over some of the leftover funds in her 529 account to a Roth IRA for the year 2024. She had already made the contribution for 2023 and maxed that out. So this would be a 2024 contribution. What I also understand, and I would double check this, but I understand that even though it's called a rollover, it is considered to be a contribution. What that would mean is that if the beneficiary had yet to fill up the 2023 allowance for a contribution to a Roth IRA, they could effectively convert 529 assets before they file their tax return or April 15th for a contribution for the year 2023. So that's very interesting. Even though they call it a rollover, It's actually considered as a contribution. And as you may be aware, you can make contributions to your IRA, whether it be Roth or traditional, for the prior year up until April 15th or when you file your tax return, whichever's earlier. She had already filled up the 2023 bucket, so this was a 2024 contribution, so that nuance didn't apply. Here's our experience. We have the 529 in the Colorado plan. Now, I called them at the beginning of January because I could not find the form on their website. And here's the critical aspect. You can't make a distribution and then make a contribution to an IRA for it to qualify. It must be a trustee to trustee transfer. In other words, the money needs to move from the 529 plan directly to the Roth IRA of the beneficiary. Because of that, it needed a special form that specifically stated that. I called them because I could not find the form, and they actually said it's not available yet. Maybe by the end of the month, or just keep checking is basically what they said, which was a little frustrating because everyone knew this was going to come down the pike and they probably should have been ready for this. And I think they probably thought, oh, not many people are going to take advantage of this. But from what I hear, a lot of people are very interested in doing this. Well, I kept checking and checking and checking. Eventually, towards the end of January, the form did appear on the website. So that form is available. It is a specific form for doing this special rollover from the 529 into a Roth IRA. Now, you would think that you could just fill out the form online and submit it. Not in Colorado. You need to print it out, fill it out with the information of the account that the money is coming from and the information of the account that it's going to. Now, if you're in Colorado, you may be aware that Vanguard is the custodian of the 529 plan. Coincidentally, the Roth IRA that the money was going into is an account also held at Vanguard, my daughter's Roth IRA. So I would have thought I could fill out the form, upload it electronically. They would basically just move the money electronically from the 529 plan directly into the Roth IRA at Vanguard, and it would take no time. But that's not exactly what happened. So first, I had to print out the form, fill it out, sign it, and physically mail it in. So I did that on January 24th. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll just keep checking the 529 plan and see that the money has left the plan. Time passed, a week passed. 2 weeks later, I noticed that the amount was processed. She had at least $7,000 in the account and wanted to make a full contribution. She has enough earnings this year to support that. So she could do the full $7,000 contribution. And we did see that that left the account on February 6th. And I assumed that the money would show up pretty quickly at Vanguard. It's the same custodian. It probably should take a day or two, maybe, right? Then I checked the Vanguard account. 1 day later, 3 days later, 4 days later, 5 days later, still hasn't shown up. And now I'm thinking, uh-oh, what happened? Did something go wrong? Well, it appears that even though the custodian is the same, they actually mailed a check to Vanguard, which is what it says it will do. But you would think if it's the same custodian, they could do it electronically. And of course, when you mail a check from one custodian to the other, there's always the risk of an issue. Anyway, it did ultimately show up on February 12th, which was a week after the amount was processed out of the 529. So the entire process took about 3 weeks once the form was available on the plan website. Maybe this will be quicker going forward for those in Colorado. Maybe I was just one of the first people that did this. Maybe it's going to take them a little time to figure out how to do this more efficiently, but that was my experience. But it did work. So you can go ahead and do these if your account meets those specifications. Again, the account must have been open for at least 15 years. The assets that are being transferred to the Roth IRA must be at least 5 years old, and the 529 beneficiary must be the same person as the owner of the Roth IRA. And again, if you change the beneficiary, even if the account was open for 15 years, but the beneficiary changed within that 15-year period, I would wait for further clarification to find out if that's going to be okay. Here's another interesting fact about the 529 plan in Colorado. Colorado has determined that a distribution for this purpose, while allowed, is a non-qualified distribution. And what that means is that it will be subject to state tax recapture in Colorado. If you make a contribution to your 529 plan, you get a state tax deduction. They're going to be looking to recapture that deduction, and that would be on the contribution portion of the rollover. And what it also means is that there will be state income tax on the earnings portion. So effectively, the entire conversion will be taxed either through recapture or normal income tax for the entire amount. But again, it's only on the state side. On the federal side, there's no tax consequence and there's no 10% withdrawal penalty. So that's good at least, but on the state side, it's going to be affected. This is not the case for all states, and I'm going to put a link into the show notes. There is a website called 529conference.com, and they wrote an article about which states are considering it a qualified distribution and which states aren't. There are 30 states that consider the distribution a qualified expense. Of course, on the federal side, there won't be the 10% withdrawal penalty. There won't be federal income tax, but there also will not be state tax. I'm not going to list all of the states, but if you go to the show notes and you click on the link, you'll see the article and you'll see the states that are listed. There are currently 12 states that are considering it a non-qualified expense subject to recapture and state income tax. And as I said, Colorado is one. California is also one. I will name them: California, Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, New York, Utah, and Vermont. And then there are 8 other states plus District of Columbia where it's pending or there's been no decision or it's unclear. And those are, since there's only 8, I'll name those: Arkansas, Connecticut, District of Columbia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Rhode Island. So therefore, any of the states I did not name, it would be a qualified expense. And again, go to the article and you can verify your state and see how it stands. But that was my experience, and I just thought I would share that. I was a guinea pig, and it all worked out, but it was not as smooth as I would have expected it. But I would presume that things will get smoother going forward. But this does give you one more release valve for assets that are in a 529 plan that are not used for higher education or qualified education expenses. So this may give you a reason to consider contributing to a 529 because this exit now exists. And that was one of the reasons people didn't want to contribute to 529 plans, because they said, what if my child doesn't go to school and doesn't need the money for school? I would argue that this is a nice safety valve outlet to be able to jumpstart their retirement savings if they have excess funds left in a 529 plan. Again, they must meet those rules, but in our case, the account met the rules because we opened it early. So this would be a real good reason to go ahead and open a 529 account and get that 15-year clock started. It doesn't say all of the money has to be in there 15 years ago. It just says that the account has to have existed. And most states only require a nominal amount to open an account. Many states are like $25. Some, I think, may not even have a minimum. But just put in a token amount, get the 15-year clock started, and then at least you can start working towards satisfying that main requirement, which is a very lengthy requirement. So definitely a reason to at least open a 529 account. I hope this was helpful, and we will go on to the next part of the podcast. All right, now let's move on to listener questions. This question comes from RK in Texas, who is married with 2 kids, aged 10 and 3. And first he says, I listened to your first podcast twice. Really awesome. Thank you. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate that. I also really appreciate all of the great reviews that have been left. If you want to leave a review and then send me a screenshot of it with your address, you can send it to me at mark@marksmoneymind.com, and I'll send you some swag. I said I would do it to the first 20 people. I've had well over 20 reviews, but I have not received 20 people sending me their address yet. I've had quite a few of them, so there's a few spots left in the 20, so feel free to send that to me. So back to the question here. Let's read it. My wife and I make between $310,000 to $330,000 per year. Sounds like they're both working. Awesome job, by the way. That's an incredible amount of income. Kudos to you guys. And it continues. The last 4 years, we've been contributing to a traditional 401k and maxing it out. We also have access to after-tax contributions and then convert them to Roth. Between the two of us, we put in around $70,000 after tax. So they're doing a backdoor Roth contribution. We'll probably talk about those in the future, but basically you can contribute over and above the maximum you're allowed to do on a pre-tax basis, on an after-tax basis, and then convert that to the Roth component of the 401k, and in some cases even transfer that out to a Roth IRA. So that's what they are doing there. Very smart. Well done. Our highest tax bracket is the 24% bracket. Yes, you are deep into the 24% tax bracket. And he continues, my questions. Should we change to Roth 401k and pay taxes up front, which would be about $11,000? And then he continues with, we have $350,000 in the pre-tax 401k. We have $250,000 in a taxable brokerage account and $185,000 in a Roth IRA, or the after-tax Roth contribution money. That totals up to $785,000. And then he continues, if my FI number, so financial independence number, is 2 million, when should I stop maxing out 401k and invest more in taxable brokerage? So let's stop there and talk about that a little bit. And again, this is not advice. This is just me musing on these questions and thinking about how I would go about potentially thinking about these. This is certainly not specific advice in any way, just how I might think about this question. I believe you are around 40 years old, if I recall, because we've had a few other conversations. And if we were simply to look at where you stand today, the $785,000, and then later in the email, and we'll get to it, but you say your monthly expenses are around $7,000 a month. So that works out to about $84,000. So I just did some quick back of the envelope math here to figure out how much you're contributing, how much excess there is, how much you're spending in expenses. And here's how I came to those numbers. So I took an income figure of $320,000. I subtract out, maxing out the 401ks, $23,000 each for a total of $46,000. And then I looked at the standard deduction, because you mentioned later, and we'll get to this, that you are renting. So I presume you're taking the standard deduction of $29,000. So your income tax after deductions and standard deduction is approximately $52,000 a year. You have 2 children under the age of 16, so you get the child tax credit of $4,000. Let's just say $48,000 net income tax. Your living expenses are $84,000. You're doing the backdoor Roth of $70,000. If I subtract all of those, I come to an excess amount of about $70,000 roughly. So I'm assuming you might be saving that in a brokerage account. So let's just go with that assumption. To get to an FI goal of $2 million, starting with $785,000, contributing $46,000 to a pre-tax 401k plan, $70,000 to the Roth via the back door, and then another $70,000 to the brokerage for a total annual contribution of $186,000. Man, that just blows my mind. That is just a massive amount of savings. That's over a 50% savings rate. Kudos to you guys. Hopefully you are living a well-balanced lifestyle on your $84,000 of living expenses and aren't depriving yourself of anything. But if you're able to save that amount of money and have a wonderful life, that is just awesome. You're going to reach your goal in a very short period of time. And in fact, I calculated that out. So I use a 6% rate of return. And the reason behind that is we have to come up with some kind of rate of return to use in our calculation. And typically what I will do is use a 60-40 hypothetical portfolio to just get what is a historical rate of return. So it's 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Historically, it's been around 9%. And the reason I use 6 instead of 9 is because when we think of numbers, frequently we're thinking in today dollars. So I want to discount that so we can think about our spending in today dollars and not in future dollars. So basically what I do is I just bring that 9% down to 6%. And theoretically, again, this is back of the envelope math, it should be taking care of the inflation component. So if we use a 6% rate of return, if we're saying we need X number of dollars per year in spending, and that's 10 years down the road, it's in today dollars. So that's how I come about using a 6% rate of return so we can not have to inflate everything and then discount it back to the present. I know that's a roundabout way of explaining why I use 6%. But anyway, stay with me here. I'm using 6%. So $185,000 starting point, contributing $186,000 a year. You get to just over $2 million in 55 months. That's 4.5 years. So if $2 million is your FI number, and I presume you came up with that by saying what level of assets would support an approximate $80,000 lifestyle using the 4% rule or 25 times your current expenses, you get to that $2 million. So I'm presuming that's how you came about that number. And I don't have any quibbles with that, so we'll just stick with it. What that means is in 55 months, going at the rate you are, spending what you're spending, saving what you're saving, earning what you're earning, you would hit your FI number in 4.5 years. When should you change to a Roth 401k from a traditional 401k? Here's my thinking about this. So if you're, let's say, 40 years old, and you think you're going to hit your FI number and potentially stop working in 4 to 5 years, you're going to be 45 years old. A couple of things. I agree. You're going to need to have access to some non-qualified money to pay for your life between ages 45 and 59.5 when you can access your traditional IRA, traditional 401k, Roth IRA without penalty. Of course, you can always get your contributions from your Roth IRA at any time. But let's break it down further. You say you have $250,000 in your brokerage, and I estimated a contribution of $70,000 per year over that 55 months or 4.5 years. That would bring that account to approximately $700,000. Your 401k pre-tax, if you just stayed the way you're doing it, $350,000 plus the $46,000 that you're maxing out each, and that is assuming that doesn't increase. And of course, usually there's cost of living increases to the amount that you can contribute to a 401k, but we're just going to stay static at the $46,000. That then would bring you to another $700,000 in your pre-tax 401k. And then the Roth at $185,000, continuing to do the backdoor Roth at $70,000 a year, would bring you to $611,000. At your FI moment, you would end up with $700,000 in brokerage, $700,000 in traditional 401k, a little over $600,000 in the Roth. The $700,000 in the brokerage account would be fully accessible to you, and some of the Roth, the contribution portion, would be as well, pre-59.5. The $700,000 in the brokerage would give you a pretty long runway, about 8 years, if my top of the head math is correct. In the meantime, so now you're not working, you're no longer in the 24% tax bracket. You may, in fact, be in the lowest tax brackets at that point, because you really are probably just going to have brokerage earnings, which would be capital gains and dividends, let's say. So you have a lot of room in the lower tax brackets to do Roth conversions. Now, if you have an 8-year runway in your brokerage account, you could do some Roth IRA conversions once you stop working at a much lower tax bracket than your current 24% tax bracket. And those conversions would be accessible after they've aged for 5 years each. So this is what's called a Roth conversion ladder. So you could, in your first year after working, in your first year of full retirement, you could do a Roth conversion. And then 5 years later, you would have full access to the money that you converted, not the earnings on them, but the money you converted without penalty and without tax, because you would have already paid the tax when you converted it. Now, of course, that means you need some money in your brokerage account to pay those taxes. But with an 8-year runway, I haven't mathed it out, but I would think you probably do have the ability to pay the taxes from the brokerage account and still have 5 years worth of income in that brokerage account. That's the way I would think about it. I would say at this point, if it were me, I probably would still be contributing to the traditional 401k and getting the tax deduction at the 24% tax bracket. Now, I would monitor this over time, and maybe later down the road, a couple of years later, that could change, because everything could change. Your income could change, your savings rate could change, your expenses can change, a lot can change. So that's why it's important to review this and monitor this and make changes when necessary. That's the way I would think about the first of those 2 bullet points. Now, your next one is about housing. And he writes, house. My current monthly expense is $7,000 per month, not including travel. I foresee that I would pay off my car loan in a year. Also, in another 1.5 years, my daughter will go to public school, kindergarten. So I would save $1,200 on daycare. I presume that's per month. Combining these 2 expenses, I would have an extra $2,000 per month, I presume. I'm spending around $1,900 in rent. A decent house for rent, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, is about $3,000 to $3,200. So the $2,000 after the car loan is paid off and the daycare ends, plus the current rent, would be $3,900, and you could rent a house for $3,000 to $3,200. So could you upgrade? Yeah, sounds like it's a wash, right? And then you write, going by house price to rent ratio, $3,000 times 12 months times 16 equals $576,000. I'm not going to get into what all that means, but I think what he's saying is that a reasonable house on a rent versus buy ratio would be put you in that $576,000 range. And he says that's around the same amount the houses are available here. We are making a lifestyle decision and in no way considering a future house as an investment. What would you do in my situation for buying a house? So if you've made the determination that it suits your needs, I think the math in this case, as you mentioned it, makes sense. It's really a wash. I did a few calculations here just to see how that would affect your renting and saving versus buying a house and the cost and associated with that. If a house is $580,000 and you put 20% down, that's approximately $120,000, maybe including the closing costs. Given a 6.5% mortgage rate, your principal and interest would be about $3,000 a month. And of course, that doesn't include taxes and insurance, so you would need to add that in there. So if you were going to rent versus buy, it might cost you a little bit more to buy than rent, but it seems like it's fairly equivalent, especially if you're talking about renting that 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for $3,000 to $3,200. So I think it's just a personal decision whether you do it or not. But it does change some of the other math, and here's where it changes that. So where would the down payment come from? I'm presuming the brokerage account. So your $250,000 brokerage account, you would be taking $120,000 out of it for the down payment, and your ongoing expenses would be relatively equivalent, as we just went through. But what that means is that your brokerage is now $130,000. Your pre-tax 401k is still the $350,000. The Roth is still the $185,000 for a total of $665,000. If you are still contributing the same $186,000 a year because your expenses haven't really changed because of the netting out of the car payment being gone and the daycare being gone, but increasing the rent and or mortgage payment instead of rent, what that would mean is that it will take you a little longer to get to your FI number. And I calculated that out using the same 6%, using the 665 as the starting assets as opposed to the 785. And it basically means that you would reach your FI number at 61 months. So it'll take you 6 months longer to reach your FI number. And I would say that if that's acceptable to you, then yeah, sure, makes sense. I would also say that if you're going to move in short order, buying a house may not make sense because there's a lot of cost involved in buying the house and then reselling a house. So my kind of rule of thumb personally is I want to know for sure that I'm going to be in that house for at least 5 years. And then also I want to make sure that house and its payment is going to fit in with my post-retirement lifestyle. So when we bought the house that we're currently in, I was thinking about it from the standpoint of if I didn't have income, if I was retired, would I still want the house cost and the payments associated with it in that post-retirement period? And so we bought our house with that in mind. So I would potentially think about that. So if you're good with reaching your FI number 6 months later because you have such an aggressive savings, yeah, sure, go for it. Your choice. And lastly, he ends with, see you at EconoMe. Awesome. I will be there. I will definitely look for you. And please look for me. I hope I answered your question. If you would like to submit a question to the podcast, just send it to me at mark@marksmoneymind.com. Put podcast question in the subject line, and I hope to be able to answer it on the show. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future shows. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. The first 20 people who send a screenshot of your review along with your mailing address to me at mark@marksmoneymind.com will receive some Mark's Money Mind swag. If you would like me to answer a question on the show, please send it to me at mark@marksmoneymind.com and put podcast question in the subject line. Let me know your first name, or let me know if you would like to remain anonymous, and also your state of residence if you choose. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next week on the Mark's Money Mind Show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. And now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.